Today we're going to be looking at Unit 8, Notes Number 2, Kennedy's New Frontier. The Promise of Progress. Kennedy set out to transform his broad vision of progress into what he called the New Frontier. Kennedy had a difficult time turning his vision into a reality. He offered Congress proposals to provide medical care for the aged, rebuild urban areas, and aid education, but could not get enough votes. Conservative Republicans and Southern Democrats blocked these ideas. Since Kennedy had been elected by a small margin, he lacked a popular mandate, a clear indication that voters approved of his plans. Kennedy was able to enact measures to boost the economy, build national defense, provide international aid, and fund a massive space program. Stimulating the economy. One domestic problem the Kennedy team tackled was the economy. By 1960, America was in a recession, so not as bad as the Great Depression, but there was high unemployment, there weren't as many jobs, people were not spending as much money, so just the economy was slowing down. Kennedy's advisors pushed for deficit spending to stimulate the economy, meaning the government would spend money to fund programs very similar to the New Deal in order to get the economy moving again. In 1961, Congress approved a package that increased the minimum wage to $1.25 an hour, extended unemployment insurance, and provided assistance to cities with high unemployment. Addressing poverty abroad. One of the first campaign promises that Kennedy fulfilled was the creation of the Peace Corps. This was a program of volunteer assistance to developing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. The Peace Corps became a huge success. We would see primarily college-age students volunteering, but people of all ages signed up to work as agricultural advisors, teachers, or health aides in these countries. Race to the Moon. On April 12, 1961, the Soviets launched the first human into space. Kennedy saw this as a challenge and vowed that we would surpass the Soviets by sending a man to the moon by the end of the 1960s. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, began to launch new facilities in Cape Canaveral, Florida, and Houston, Texas. 7 years later, on July 20th, 1969, the U.S. would achieve its goal. Neil Armstrong would be the first man to walk on the moon. As a result of the space program, universities expanded their science programs. The huge federal funding gave rise to new industries. Space and defense-related industries sprang up in southern and western states. The moon landing. So Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin made up the team of Apollo 11 that landed on the moon. So here's a picture of all three and then of Neil Armstrong on the moon. Addressing domestic problems. While progress was being made on the new frontiers of space exploration and international aid, many Americans suffered at home. Kennedy had not pushed aggressively for legislation on issues of poverty and civil rights. In 1963, Kennedy began to focus more closely on these issues at home. He called for a national assault on the causes of poverty, ordered Robert Kennedy, his brother, and also his attorney general to investigate racial injustices in the South, and presented Congress with a civil rights bill and proposal to cut taxes by over $10 billion. So he had major plans to kind of overhaul things within the U.S. So let's stop and think. How does Kennedy try to improve America? So he's trying to keep us competitive with the Soviets, advancing the space program, the space race to the moon. He's also trying to focus on civil rights issues, trying to get Congress to pass new civil rights legislation, seeing the issue of poverty, trying to improve it with deficit spending, trying to get America out of its recession. So he has lots of ideas, but he's also having some difficulty working with Congress. Tragedy in Dallas. In the fall of 1963, public opinion polls showed that Kennedy was losing popularity because of his advocacy for civil rights. So he already began campaigning for the 1964 presidential election. He would travel to Texas on a 4-day visit with his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, who was from Texas, hoping to gain more support and popularity. On the morning of November 22nd, 1963, Kennedy landed in Dallas, Texas on a campaign visit. Jackie and her husband sat in the back seat of an open-air limousine with the Texas governor and his wife. As they drove past the Texas School Book Depository, the president was shot in the head. Lee Harvey Oswald would be charged with the murder. He would later be shot and killed by Jack Ruby as he was being transferred to a different jail. So here's a photograph from the funeral. President Kennedy would be buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and Jackie Kennedy modeled his funeral after Abraham Lincoln's. She also had an eternal flame placed on his grave. So this is a picture of her with their two children, Caroline and Jack Jr. This is Robert Kennedy, Kennedy's youngest brother, or Kennedy's brother, and Ted Kennedy, his other brother. Unanswered questions. Many people question if Kennedy's assassination was part of a conspiracy. In 1963, the Warren Commission investigated and concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald had shot the president while acting alone. In 1979, a reinvestigation concluded that Oswald was part of a conspiracy. Investigators also said that two persons may have fired at the president. Possible explanations included a plot by anti-Castro Cubans, to a communist-sponsored attack, to a conspiracy by the CIA. So still no clear-cut answers. Lyndon Johnson would now become the president. He would take over Kennedy's, the last year of his presidency, and would do his best to continue with Kennedy's legacy. So let's stop and think. How did the Kennedy's assassination impact the country? So first, shock, because something like this hadn't happened since Abraham Lincoln. People were shocked about it, confused, and understand why, but it was a smooth transition of power to Johnson, and so that was able to kind of reassure the nation that everything was going to be okay. Next week, we will pick up with Johnson's presidency and his Great Society.